This video is, in a way, the second part of the tribute to the new wave of British heavy metal. It covers how the dynamics of the British movement passed and continued in continental Europe even after 1983, the year when the new wave of British heavy metal is considered to have fallen. This is done through a series of bands that were formed around that time throughout the continent. But how exactly did the British inspire these bands? First of all, the records of the new wave of British heavy metal artists who had signed with major record labels, Iron Maiden, Saxon, Def Leppard, Diamond Head, were released throughout Europe, and some of the albums of the others, Venom, Tank, Demon, etc., certainly found their way to various European countries. At the same time, as early as 1980, bands from the British scene began touring Europe, and many young people who saw them decided to form their own bands in turn, just as had happened in the United Kingdom a few years earlier. Of course, some local bands that were formed around the same time as their British counterparts also played a role in this. And indeed, if the new wave of British heavy metal had not been so strictly locally defined, they would certainly have been a part of it. Let me say here that the European bands I will present belong to three categories. Those that were contemporaneous with the new wave of British heavy metal, those that were inspired by it and formed in the first half of the 80s, and finally, those that came later, in the second half. In this last category, we also had influences from other, more popular metal subgenres of that time, so some of its members do not represent a pure continuation of the original movement. Let me emphasize here that this tribute will be based on pure heavy metal bands only, with some references to American-style speed or power metal, not thrash, not death metal, and not European power metal as it started with Halloween and onward. I will focus primarily on Germany, Sweden, Spain, France, and Italy, and then cover the scenes of Eastern Europe plus the rest of the continent. At the end of the video, there is also a segment about Brazil and Argentina, because I believe that their scenes had many common characteristics with the corresponding European ones. I feel that I have to start with the largest heavy metal scene in the history of continental Europe, both in terms of the number of bands and success beyond the country's own borders. No matter how we look at it, this scene practically started with just one band, Scorpions. The band from Hanover had started back in 1965, but it wasn't until 1979 that they made their big international breakthrough. The departure of the exceptional guitarist Uli Jon Roth brought a change in the band's style toward a more direct and straightforward sound aimed at the American market. At the same time, the enormous success of the albums released in 78-79, namely the live Tokyo tapes and the studio Love Drive, paved the way for global recognition, which would come very soon. Obviously, the Scorpions do not belong in our tribute, but they are fundamental because they showed to hundreds of young musicians practically all over Europe that in order to achieve massive success in the heavy rock scene, it is not necessary to be English or American. On the other hand, those who clearly belong in this video are a band whose journey had so much in common with the new wave of British heavy metal bands that some considered them, and not without reason, an honorary member of it. This band, of course, is none other than Accept. The similarities are striking. They started in the early 70s from a town near Düsseldorf, the center of the German working class. They released two rather mediocre albums in 1979 and 1980 with a small German label. They made their first successful album in 1981 with Breaker, at which point they began to crystallize their style. They created a buzz for their name with the 1982 album Restless and Wild, their first record to enter the charts anywhere. They signed with a multinational and skyrocketed to the top with Balls to the Wall in 1983, which eventually went gold in America, and the rest, as they say, is history. Even their attempt at the end of the decade to approach glam metal reflects similar attempts by British bands. Their success was so great that even the band of their singer, Udo Dirkschneider, called UDO, had a certain level of success just because it was associated with them. Close behind was another German band that managed to transcend the borders of its homeland and achieve global success, Warlock. They also originated from Düsseldorf, where they were founded in 1983. Their trajectory was steadily upward through the 4 albums they released from 1984 to 1987. Of course, their success was greatly aided by the striking presence of Doro Pesch on vocals. At that time, a woman in a heavy metal band was not something common, and Doro immediately captured everyone's attention. It is no coincidence that on the cover of their last and most successful album, Triumph and Agony from 1987, there is a painting that practically depicts Doro, ignoring the rest of the band. Perhaps unsurprisingly, by the end of 1988, the band had disbanded and Doro began a high-profile solo career, which, however, did not achieve the success that some might have expected. From then on, the most well-known scenes in Germany within the broader metal genre were two: the Teutonic thrash scene, which started in the mid-80s, and the European power metal scene, which began in the late 80s and grew significantly in the 90s. However, beyond these two scenes, there were some bands that we can say honored the spirit of pure heavy metal as it was expressed by the new wave of British heavy metal. They are the following. It is amazing what's happening with Sweden. A country of about 10 million people is the third most profitable in the world in music royalties and music artist exports, behind only the USA and the United Kingdom. Why is this happening? The answer is not something I can know for sure, as I'm not Swedish, but there are certainly some factors that play a role. Definitely the fact that the average Swede speaks English almost as well as a native speaker, as well as the state providing about 30% of the student population with free quality public music education called communal music schola. Add to this a natural tendency for Scandinavians to understand what works and what doesn't in a song, having grown up with bands like ABBA, and you have the full context. The first Swedish band to play heavy rock was the heavy psych band November, which released 3 albums between 1970 and 1972, singing in Swedish. They were particularly heavy for the time, clearly influenced by Cream, and they managed to gain some popularity when they toured the United Kingdom, but immediately after they disbanded. So they are not exactly the Scorpions of Sweden. However, the band that is likely to be the accept of Sweden in the sense that they gave the real start of the metal scene in the country and immediately connected with the British scene is Heavy Load. In fact, there are quite a few who either mistakenly or intentionally consider them a proper new wave of British heavy metal band. Even their trajectory supports this. They released their best albums in 1982, Death or Glory, and 1983, Stronger Than Evil, and then disbanded, unable to keep up with the changing times. They have recently returned with a very good new album. A key difference between the Swedish scene and the British one is that punk did not directly influence the metal bands in the country. Thus, apart from the names of the new wave of British heavy metal, influences were also drawn from proto-metal bands like Deep Purple, Rainbow or Whitesnake, which quickly led to the emergence of more melodic hard rock artists compared to other countries. Anyway, the bands were indeed many, and not only that, but there was even an acronym, FVASHM, which stands for Första Vängen av Svensk Heavy Metal, which translates to First Wave of Swedish Heavy Metal. The term first appeared in the late 70s and early 80s in various magazines in the country, such as Rocket. Just like in the United Kingdom, there is not much homogeneity in the sound covered by the term, but is more local and temporal, meaning it expresses a specific period in Swedish heavy rock. From then on, as many of you probably know, two bands emerged in the mid-80s that achieved worldwide success and took the sound of Swedish heavy metal in completely different directions. These are Candlemas and Bathory, to which Entombed would later be added. Obviously, they do not belong in our tribute, since there was a clear differentiation from the classic heavy metal sound for all three. The case of Europe is very special. They were formed in 1981, and we can say that their first two albums belong to the realm of melodic heavy metal with hard rock elements, or the other way around, depending on how you see it. Of course, the reason literally the entire planet got to know them is their third album, on which they clearly entered the glam metal scene. This album made them one of the most famous rock bands in the world for years to come. Also, I believe it is worth mentioning guitar virtuoso Yngwie Malmsteen, who, as you probably know, is Swedish, but moved to Los Angeles in 1983 where he built his entire music career, with a sound that appealed more to the American audience, although, at least at the beginning, maintained some connection to his European roots. Besides all these cases, we also had a series of names that I believe meet the criteria I set at the beginning, and so we will present them immediately. Despite the fact that Spain lived for 38 years through a dictatorship repressive on many issues, this does not mean that it was cut off from the rest of the world. In fact, the country developed a series of musical movements, of which the most significant for our narrative is the so-called rock urbano español, whose sound was characterized as hard rock from the 70s but without the blues elements, which gave it a much more urban and street sound. When the new wave of British heavy metal riffs were finally heard in Spain, a new generation of bands transformed rock urbano into pure heavy metal. In a clear parallel with its British counterpart, Spanish heavy metal was distinctly working class in its demeanor. The lyrical content was practically always the same, songs that spoke about the difficulties of everyday life and the love for rock, drinking and women. However, some bands occasionally addressed the political climate of the time and the disillusionment of working-class youth with the country's transition to democracy. Spanish heavy metal had two significant focal points. One was in Vallecas, a traditionally poor neighborhood in the suburbs of Madrid. The other was Chapadiscos, a record label founded by Vicente Ramón Mariscal, a journalist and producer who established it in the late 70s to release albums by rock urbano artists, but it ultimately ended up releasing heavy metal bands instead. The truth is that Spanish heavy metal never gained significant popularity outside the country. The main reasons, in my opinion, are that almost all the bands sang in Spanish and that there was a lack of a very big name that would pull up all the others. Other reasons have been mentioned, such as the fact that many bands never gained wide distribution and touring capabilities outside of Spain, as well as a trend of foreignism among Spanish metalheads who did not like their national scene and only listened to bands from abroad. Finally, unlike the other two countries we just saw, Spain never had a major name in the subgenres of metal as they developed in the second half of the 80s. Certainly, the biggest name in the country's heavy metal scene, the only one that came close to a great international career, is Barón Rojo. They were formed in 1980 in Madrid and became not only the most famous heavy metal band in Spain, but perhaps also the only one that the average non-Spanish metalhead might know. They toured outside Spain, played at the Reading Festival in England, and appeared on the cover of Kerrang, even receiving an offer to tour in America as support for AC/DC, an offer they declined due to the high costs, a decision they would regret for the rest of their lives. Their big break seemed to be coming when they signed with Mausoleum Records, which reissued their first three albums and had them re-record the first two with English lyrics to attract a wider audience. Unfortunately, this never happened, and so they remained a name primarily known in their own country as well as in Latin America. Among the other bands, the case of Obús stands out, as they emerged within Spain as the counterbalance to Barón Rojo, with a more gritty and less polished approach to the heavy sound compared to their fellow Madrileños. Their lyrics are more aligned with working class themes and often become more serious, like in the song Pesadilla Nuclear. This approach of theirs is also evident in the music video for their song Prepárate, which directly gives you a glimpse of suburban Madrid at the beginning of the 80s. From there on, other Spanish bands that I believe are worth mentioning are In relation to the other countries we have presented, there is a significant difference here. France had a thriving pop scene that continuously supplied hits and big names not only to the domestic market but also to a large part of continental Europe and Latin America. However, this scene sang exclusively in the native language, or, as was customary at the time, in other European languages, Italian, German, Spanish, but not in English, so it remained almost unknown to the English-speaking world. So when French punk emerged, as well as the country's biggest new rock name, Telephone, this practice continued, and as was to be expected, it also spread to the country's heavy metal scene, which had its clear and distinct beginning with one name, the Parisians' Trust. They share with Heavy Load the fact that many classify them within the new wave of British heavy metal. This was aided by the fact that both Iron Maiden drummers Nico McBrain and Clive Burr passed through the ranks. They also have in common with Barón Rojo that they came very close to a major international career, which some might say they even achieved, at least during the 1979-81 period, as they managed to tour outside France and even played as support for Iron Maiden. Their ultimate inability to achieve a great career was likely due to their insistence on singing in French, although, like Barón Rojo, they released English versions for two of their albums without success, or even their choice to gradually shift to a more polished sound, incorporating many synthesizers and so on. Under no circumstances did the metalheads of the time want to hear something like that. Sales plummeted and the band disbanded in 1985. In another parallel with the new wave of British heavy metal, a thrash band, Anthrax, recorded a cover of the English version of their song Antisocial, which became their biggest hit both as a song and as a video. This renewed the public's interest in the French band, which suddenly found itself playing at the French Masters of Rock in Paris in 1988. Finally, it should be noted that unlike other heavy metal bands of the period, Trust presented some characteristics in their sound and lyrics that were not often found in the style. They were clearly influenced by AC/DC, with whom they had a personal relationship, as well as by the pure rock of the Rolling Stones. Their lyrics contained a strong social and political commentary with anarchist undertones, while as individuals they maintained a renegade attitude similar to that of the MC5. The only other heavy metal band that managed to make some noise around their name at that time in France were the also Parisians Sortilège. They started with the excellent self-titled EP, which even became one of the initial sources of inspiration for Chuck Schuldiner of Death, and followed it up with two very good albums recorded in Germany. Both of these albums were released in English versions, which sold very little, and the band also played at a series of festivals in mainland Europe. Tired of the lack of the success they had hoped for, they disbanded in 1986, only to reunite in 2019. From then on, the country gave us a series of other names that honored the inspiration and legacy of the new wave of British heavy metal and thus deserve to be mentioned. The starting point for Italy is similar to that of France. An extremely melodic language, a highly successful pop scene with great popularity in many countries of the rest of Europe and Latin America, although almost completely unknown in the English-speaking world. Here, however, the scenario changes significantly, as, in the 1970s, the Italian progressive rock scene soon came to be considered the second most impactful and successful in the world after that of England. Also, unlike the other countries we examined, Italy had a thriving punk scene, both in the classic form of the genre and in post-punk / darkwave and hardcore punk styles. These scenes were very successful and brought a kind of, let's say, competition to the local heavy metal bands and the impact they had on the youth. Perhaps that's why here we don't have a band that stands out, one that even a casual metalhead who didn't live in the country might have known. Anyway, as we will see below, several bands were formed and, surprisingly, almost all of them sang in English. Regarding recognition, there is a kind of exception which is quite particular due to its extreme nature. That is the band Death SS from Pesaro in central Italy. I am hesitant to consider the influence of the new wave of British heavy metal on them as confirmed. They had been a band for 10 years before they released their first full album, a collection of past recordings that came out in 1987. They clearly played heavy metal, but they had an extreme and uncompromising satanic image to which they perhaps gave a bit more weight and seriousness than Venom or Demon, for example. In no way did they have the street mentality that the new wave of British heavy metal displayed, nor did they have any significant influences from its more well-known names. Throughout their career, which continues to this day, they have remained primarily a cult phenomenon. From then on, all the other significant bands of the Italian peninsula in the 1980s were extreme metal bands: Necrodeath, Bulldozer, Mortuary Drape, Raw Power, Schizo. Nevertheless, there were several pure heavy metal bands worth mentioning.
Red and black, as blood and death. Look into the past and the future. Right below. Doesn't matter so again. You gotta go your way. Bomb metal.
The Eastern Bloc, or the countries behind the Iron Curtain, in the early years of the 80s, at the zenith of the Cold War, one would expect to be completely closed off to any heavy sound influences, even simple hard rock, let alone the new wave of British heavy metal. And yet, it was not so. Even in that part of the world, there were several bands, at the top of which we find the Russian Aria, the Hungarian Pokolgep, and the Polish Kat. The first were called the Iron Maiden of Russia, as they are considered to be among the 10 most popular rock bands in the history of the country's music. The second managed to play as support for Motorhead and Metallica, while the third are considered pioneers of the thrash metal sound for all of Central Europe, although the first two albums are rooted in classic heavy metal, otherwise they wouldn't be mentioned here. The countries from which these three bands originate, perhaps not coincidentally, were also the ones that gave us the most significant scenes in the region, as we will see from the names that follow.
Рождается в борьбе искусство совмещения отверстий.
A special mention should also go to the former Yugoslavia. As the country was collapsing, a wonderful rock scene, very successful both within the country's borders and in the rest of Eastern Europe, developed during the 1980s. In there, you could find everything: punk, hardcore, post-punk, dark wave, pop rock, and of course, heavy metal. In fact, in a move characteristic of the era, one of the most successful rock bands in the country, the Serbian Riblja Čorba, significantly hardened their sound in the mid-80s. However, the most important pure heavy metal band of Yugoslavia were Bosnians Divlje Jagode. They became extremely popular in their homeland, which secured them a contract with a British record label and an opportunity for international recognition under the anglicized version of their name, Wild Strawberries. This success never came due to significant member changes and a shift in sound towards glam metal. Besides them, other important bands from the area were the following. Of course, we must start with Denmark, because this country perhaps gave us the biggest names in this tribute video: Merciful Fate and the subsequent solo project of their singer King Diamond. The significance and influence that these two bands had, I don't think need to be commented on. I will simply emphasize that they quickly developed their own distinctive style, which somewhat set them apart from the standards we are examining here. Another significant band from the country is the quite successful and clearly more melodic Pretty Mates. Other names include Witchcross and Alien Force. One of the most important scenes in Europe was found in the Netherlands. For some, this may be logical, since it is the homeland of both Adrian Vandenberg and Eddie Van Halen, but for others it might come as a surprise. Here we encounter names such as Picture from Rosenburg, Angus from Amsterdam, Martyr from Utrecht, Heloise and Highway Child from Rotterdam, Vortex from Groningen, and finally Bodine, the first band of the later very well-known artist Arjen Lucassen from The Hague. Perhaps an even greater surprise is the excellent scene that neighboring Belgium provided, as the country had virtually no continuity in the various subgenres of heavy metal. Here we find Acid from Bruges, Scavenger and Killer from Antwerp, Crossfire from Aalst, Ostrogoth from Ghent, and Drakkar from Zurbis. On the other hand, countries that later developed large scenes in other metal genres but in the 80s and in classic heavy metal did not produce many names were Finland, with Oz, who soon moved to Sweden and are often considered a Swedish band, Tarot from Kuopio, Riff Raff from Oulu, and Iron Cross from Turku, and Norway with TNT from Trondheim and Arch from Sarpsborg. In my country, despite the immense popularity of heavy metal, various circumstances of the time allowed only two bands that meet the criteria we set to manage to make a record: the Athenians Spitfire and the Thessalonikians Northwind. In 1989, an album was released by the band Exoristi, which means exiled in English, which attempted something unique. heavy metal sung in Greek. It's an interesting listening experience, and, from one perspective, it has its charm.
Será la solución, destrucción.
Both countries loved and continue to love heavy metal, so it's no surprise that during the 1980s they developed extremely active and brilliant corresponding scenes. What is striking is the different way these scenes evolved. In Argentina, there was an exceptional heavy blues/heavy psych movement in the 1970s that transformed into the heavy metal of the 80s. Not coincidentally, one of the heroes of the 70s sound, guitarist Norberto Papo Napolitano, was the leader of the heavy metal band Riff. The Argentinians sang exclusively in Spanish and achieved great success in their homeland, as the difficulties in transportation at the time made it prohibitive for major heavy rock names to come to the country. Thus, the domestic scene was the only way to satisfy the public's thirst for heavy metal. The bands in the country clearly had a working class mentality, singing about the problems of the youth and society's rigidity in accepting rock music. Perhaps not coincidentally, the continuation of heavy rock in the country was an excellent stoner rock scene that began to develop in the second half of the 90s. In Brazil, things were a bit different. The heavy metal scene was not as uniform as in Argentina, nor did it achieve as much success. The country's musical tradition was not very close to heavy rock, and there was also intense internal competition. You see, the combination of a love for heavy metal with a thriving punk/hardcore punk scene led to the almost simultaneous explosion of an extreme metal movement that no one would have predicted in a country like Brazil. The rise of Sepultura as the largest exportable rock product in the history of Brazilian music attracted a significant number of bands and even crowned their city, Belo Horizonte, as the center of extreme metal throughout Latin America. As for our tribute, the bands from both countries were not missing. Let's take a look at them.
Tras el porvenir.
Muchas cosas que no pueden ser porque
Basta ya de signos de la paz. Basta de cargar con el morral.
After 32 minutes, more than 15 countries, and more than 60 bands, is there any doubt about the world revolution the new wave of British heavy metal brought to rock music all over the world? I don't think so.